Good morning, and it's a pleasure to see you again, Agnia. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much for sharing with us your opinions. I have a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
And the first one is what you mentioned that we are like in a new energy reality. So my question is, do you think that it will last after the war in Ukraine? And how do you think that it will reshape the political order worldwide?
Mm-hmm. So we are in a new energy reality today for both structural reasons that I outlined initially in my presentation, but also some more conjectural reasons based on the events right now. So what are some of the key structural factors that I believe will remain unchanged, after the war? It's global energy markets, new suppliers, again, the new key supplier of oil and gas on the global stage, the United States. The shale revolution, it's here to stay, and I think indeed many more countries will reconsider fracking and developing their own natural resources. A structural factor that has also shifted again is the new centers of energy demand. So China, India, they will drive the future. And the future of those demand markets versus the United States, again, is meeting its own demands from domestic production. And Europe's demand has essentially plateaued. But the war in Ukraine has really highlighted some key changes, such as the decreased role of Russia, both in the global energy markets. Now, of course, it still matters. And of course, we still see the pain that it can induce short-term to the European continent. But overall, its role has been reduced. And this geopolitical contest that I mentioned is here to stay between democracies and autocracies, between democratic governments and authoritarian governments. And I think we will also see some more considerations in the global energy markets about reliable and trusted energy providers versus what will be perceived as less reliable and less trustworthy energy providers.
Thank you, Agnia. You're from Lithuanian. You're Lithuanian. Lithuania was incorporated to the Soviet Union in 1944, and it declared its independence in 1990, if I recall well. So perhaps you know well the Soviet Union, its history, and also President Putin. Why don't you share with us how you foresee the war in Ukraine and the different options that Putin has at this moment?
Well, indeed, I was born in Lithuania, and at the age of 10, I moved to the United States. So in my work, I always followed this part of the world, Europe, Russia, Eurasia. In fact, my second book is called Beyond Crimea, The New Russian Empire, published by Yale University Press in 2016. I could do another presentation for you on Russian foreign policy, but we don't have the time. How do I see the war unfolding? You know, this is a very difficult situation because on the one hand, we see Vladimir Putin, an aging dictator who does not want to lose face, primarily because of his domestic political considerations. For him, losing this war, which he is losing already in factual terms, but that loss would mean that he would lose his regime and lose his power. So that's why, unfortunately, I expect that we will see a protracted war and a protracted conflict here, which again will have a major impact on the energy markets, on the European Union, and on global energy markets.
I believe that we read in the newspapers that there was some missile that was finally launched by Ukraine, and that it hit
Poland.
Yes, and Russia said that they are willing to some kind of agreements. Do you think that's true, or is just part of the game?
Well, one thing we know that right now on the battlefield and in the international diplomatic arena, Russia is losing. So it is useful for Russia right now to try to stop the conflict, the active hostilities in the winter period, to try to regroup militarily. What type of agreements would Russia propose? Well, if they get to keep part of Ukraine and so on, I suppose they would be willing to negotiate. At the same time, the Ukrainian leadership has made it clear that they're not willing to give up territory, particularly now, as they're doing well on the battlefield, and they have at least the moral support of the international community behind them, and a lot of the military support as well from a number of countries in the West, including a number of NATO countries.
Let me go back to something that you mentioned, and it is the European experience with renewables and also with fossil fuels. And it seemed to me from your presentation that you believe that Europe was mistaken to abandon fossil fuels the way they did it. Do you agree with that? And what the lessons do you think that Latin America and Colombia should learn from that?
Mm-hmm. So, in many ways, Europe is made up of different countries that also have very different priorities and very different realities on the ground. And for the last 10 years, Europe has been trying to prepare for an energy crisis, trying to increase its energy security, trying to diversify. And at the same time, they had the clear goal of moving towards renewables. The reality is a lot of countries fell short. They weren't ready for the renewables future, and now they're facing a major, major gas crunch. Germany in particular. So I do believe, in fact, that Germany's case has been one of a, frankly, great failure, and one where many countries are already watching and learning their lessons. And that's why we've seen since February, Britain reconsider fracking, France reconsider fracking. I think after the war, we're quite likely to see shale production in Ukraine, possibly Poland, but it's an individual choice for different countries because it depends on the countries. First of all, energy security considerations, what type of access to natural resources they have or they don't have. One maybe example, I would say maybe a more positive example that would be for Colombia to follow is if we take a look at Norway. So Norway is Europe's key oil and gas producer. At the same time, it's also a country very committed to a renewables future. So what has Norway done? While it continues to produce oil and gas, and particularly right now to support their allies in crises by increasing exports and sales of oil and gas across Europe, but they have also domestically implemented renewable policies. So, Norway is fortunate for the changes they have made, and in fact, they rely domestically on hydropower. 92% of their domestic electricity comes from hydropower. 1 out of 10 vehicles on the road in Norway today are electric vehicles. So what I like about Norway's case is that they are working towards both goals simultaneously, but it's not the case, well, first we'll shut off our oil and gas production, and then we'll see what happens. It's, we're producing oil and gas, and we're working towards renewables.
That's a very important lesson for Colombia. Let me go back to something that you just mentioned, and it has to do with energy security. So some believe that because of the war and the new energy reality, that perhaps the climate change targets will be postponed or let's put it in another way, that energy security has become a very, very important. Do you think that will last? And how do you foresee energy security in the years to come?
So I think this crisis have taught a number of countries lessons, and I think there will be, again, a refocus on energy security. Now, of course, oftentimes countries forget these lessons. I mean, really, in Europe, after 2009, when Russia had shut off gas to Ukraine, and a lot of European countries were impacted, actually there were citizens in Poland that froze to death. So you can imagine, of course, Poland took action. They built LNG import terminals. In Germany that winter, no citizens froze to death, so they didn't build LNG import terminals. I think it's important to learn from the mistakes of neighboring countries versus, wait to see what happens, the crisis in your country. But I think there will be a sort of rebalancing and reconsideration for energy security. How long that trend will last, again, it remains to be seen. But when it comes to renewables, I think a number of countries will also decide these priorities for themselves. I think Europe probably will be a leader in the world when it comes to making that transition to renewables. Possibly the United States. That will depend, of course, in the politics to come, whether President Trump is re-elected again now in the 2024. I think he will probably put more of a brakes on America's renewables agenda and will refocus on domestic energy production, but that something remains to be seen. And I think other countries will follow. I think fossil fuels will remain important in the foreseeable future in China and India, certainly with their vast energy demand, and I think in a lot of the developing world as well.
Let me go back to something that you mentioned, and it is that when you were just describing the new energy reality, you did an emphasis on the demand. And you mentioned China, you mentioned India. What role do you think that China is going to be playing in this new energy reality and geopolitics?
Mm-hmm. So China will play a very significant role, of course, as a rising power. There's no mistake about it. It's a rising economic power. It's, I think, increasingly trying to position itself, and is already, to a great degree, is a global political power with its efforts to spread its influence across the world, particularly in developing countries, but in beyond as well. China has... I've studied China's energy policy quite intensively, and I think it has one of the, frankly, best thought out energy policies from the perspective that they have learned the mistakes from Europe. It's very clear that China will not be dependent on any particular source or country for energy. They, first of all, pursue their own domestic production. They were one of the countries, one of the four original countries that fracked. Now that has been joined by Saudi Arabia and Australia. So they have their own fracking industry. They are also investing in renewables. They are also investing in piped gas, in LNG, in everything that you can imagine to try to meet their energy needs in a very diversified way. And again, so that they're not reliant on any one country. They're importing from Central Asia, from Russia, from Australia, from around the world.
Well, I believe that they know very well what they're doing. You have done extensive research on natural gas and geopolitics, and there are like different views regarding the future of natural gas. Some see it as a transition fuel with different, but whatever that means. And why don't you share with us, although you did partially, how do you see the importance and future of natural gas in the decades to come?
I certainly think natural gas will be very important, certainly in the decades to come. It's not only important as a transition fuel, it's important as the cleanest fossil fuel. Again, China and India have a great appetite for natural gas because it reduces pollution in their cities, which is also becoming a domestic political issue and an issue for domestic political movements in both countries. So gas, I think in the developing world, particularly China and India, will remain well into the future and will be a key mix alongside renewables. Will some more ambitious European countries phase out gas sooner? Perhaps than others. But again, it's going to be a key mix. And particularly, I see gas in the future in LNG. Again, the rising popularity of LNG, the flexibility it allows, how it's changed gas relationships. Because in the past, gas markets used to be much more regional, based on land-based pipelines, long-term contracts, and kind of political relationships that went along with it. Over the past 10 years, we've really seen an emergence of a global gas market that somewhat parallels the oil markets, thanks to LNG in particular. So we have short-term contracts, we have spot markets, we have much more commercialized relationships, of course, until politics hits us again, like it did in the war in Ukraine.
Perhaps this is a question with no clear answer, and it is obviously there has been a discussion. There is a discussion regarding how long does energy transition will take. What we should understand when we talk about energy transition, if we should be talking more about energy addition or diversification. How do you see like the horizon of energy transition worldwide and timings?
Here, I would say it's very difficult to predict because, on the one hand, we see certain trajectories right now that we see with solar or wind energy, certain things like hydrogen becoming increasingly popular, increasingly adapted in Europe. But the reality is that new innovations, new breakthroughs happen unexpectedly, like black swan events. And if we take a look even at the history of shale gas or fracking is old. I mean, it started in 1949. But nothing was really happening for many, many decades. And then all of a sudden, boom, we had a revolution. And I would believe that we're going to see something like this with renewables in the future. Today, it looks like we still have a long uphill battle with renewables. But we never know what great minds of this world, innovators, what they're going to come up with and when we can truly feel that, when we can genuinely say, we have a renewables, we have a green revolution.
You mentioned fracking, and as you know, there has been a profound debate regarding fracking in Colombia for more than a decade, and there were some pilot projects that were going to take place, and well, the current government decided not to go ahead with them. Why don't you share with us, like, what are like the geopolitical interests behind the discussion worldwide, the discussion on fracking, the countries that have decided like to create a bad atmosphere regarding fracking, and why? What's behind the scenes that sometimes in countries like Colombia we don't see clearly?
Indeed, the discussion on fracking has been very controversial, not only in Colombia, but also across the world. And one area here I'd like to share as someone also who works extensively on Russian foreign policy is that fracking and the shale revolution has really hurt Russia's interests, its source of revenue, its source of influence and power. And therefore, indeed, it's a fact that Russian interests have been behind a lot of propaganda and against fracking. So even, in the United States, movies have been made against fracking, or within the European Union, a lot of that debate. And that indeed now we know has been financed by Russian interests. Another element to consider also, maybe I'll mention, when we think of fracking, so that fracking revolution happened in North America because of the innovation in this field that was conducive and suitable for North American geological conditions. So while a lot of countries maybe also wanted to pursue shale production, the technological innovations weren't fully there yet that would meet their geological conditions, like the geological conditions of Europe, of Ukraine, for example. And I think in some regards, we're still waiting for more innovation in this area to make it more environmentally friendly, to make it more suitable to different parts of the world, to make it more efficient, and so on.
I have two last questions. The one has to do with, I believe you're aware of a discussion. I don't know if it is taking place in many other countries, but at least in Colombia, regarding economic degrowth, and as a strategy to reduce the demand consumption of fossil fuels. What do you think of this initiative, and if you think that it is a valid policy for countries like Colombia with all its needs?
Economic degrowth. It's a very old theory. Let's test it out. The audience, please raise your hand, those who want economic degrowth. Be brave and be honest. Who will vote for economic degrowth here? And I don't see any hands. Maybe there's a hand. No. And I think if we go out into the street of Bogota, if we ask some passerbyers, are you looking for economic degrowth? Again, I think very few people would agree with this. But more seriously, I think when countries can make these considerations, it's very hard for political leaders to pursue economic degrowth. Generally, they promise economic growth. But at the same time, we have to consider some sustainable economic development. And I think also all of us as consumers, we're making choices every single day. We're making choices whether we want to maybe buy a sustainable product, a longer-lasting product, versus, let's say, we would just want to purchase more cheaper products. I personally am a very conscious shopper, and I personally make decisions every day as a consumer, choosing more sustainable products and longer-lasting, higher-quality products. So less is more. I mean, in fact, I was raised, my grandparents used to say, I'm not rich enough to buy cheap products. So single-use products are not only not long-lasting, they're also bad for the environment. So I think it's choices that we make as individuals, as society, every day.
My last question, Agnia, is I think it was very interesting from your presentation when you mentioned that countries like Colombia must make a decision if we're going to be aligned with autocracies or democracies. And in the case of Colombia, for example, there's also another debate regarding if the role that Venezuela should be playing in the energy security of Colombia. As you know, well, Venezuela has huge reserves of oil and gas, but it's really an autocracy, okay? And you mentioned about the importance of being reliable, and when it comes to energy security. Why don't you comment a little bit on that, and if you can, please?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a tough. Well, frankly, for me, it's tough to understand this consideration that Colombia would choose, having its own resources, that it would choose to rely on its energy security and would forsake its energy independence on a neighbor that, well, today is frankly unstable, not more than it's just an authoritarian government, but it's an unstable country. And I think here, more than anything, you can look at the lessons learned by Germany. So Germany also thought that, we'll move towards this renewables revolution, but in the short term, we just have a quick and easy solution. We'll just buy cheap gas from Vladimir Putin. And we see how that turned out in reality. Not only the gas was not cheap, because Putin hiked energy prices starting this summer, then he shut off supplies, he reduced supplies, then he shut off the pipelines. Then there were certain accidents on the Nord Stream pipeline. So again, it's for a country to forsake its energy independence for an unreliable partner. I think it's a dangerous proposition, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Agnia. So please, let's give Agnia a big applause. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.